The views and opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media, Incorporated, or its assigns.
On today's Farm Connections, we visit one of the leading institutions for agriculture research, the University of Minnesota in St. Paul. First, we sit down with an entomologist to learn how pests are adopting behaviors that threaten our harvest. Then we visit with a food scientist who's developing new and healthier dairy products. And we meet our next FFA Student Leader of the Week, coming up next on Farm Connections.
Farm Connections on KSMQ, sponsored in part by the Cedars of Austin, a senior living community. We even have a retired farmers club. Independent, assisted, and memory care apartments. Learn more at cedarsofaustin.com. Will Mahler, the ag attorney, has been representing dairy farms in Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin for 37 years. Will Mahler, the ag attorney's office is in Rochester, and Will is a proud partner of Farm Connections. Thanks, Will Mahler.
One of the top concerns of farmers is pest infestation. Every growing season seems to bring a new host of threats. To get a better understanding of these challenges, I visited with Dr. Ken Ostlie of the University of Minnesota's Department of Entomology. I met up with him in one of the many beautiful gardens at the University of Minnesota's St. Paul campus.
With me today is Mr. Ken Ostlie from the Entomology Department. Ken, can you tell us about your appointment with the University of Minnesota Extension?
Nice to be with you. I'm an extension entomologist. I've been at the University of Minnesota for about 28 years, a farm boy from the western part of the state. My dad always wondered when I get back to agriculture, and the closest I got is working on insects.
Earlier you said Montevideo, Minnesota?
Yeah, I grew up just north of Montevideo on a family farm out there, and so I've had the full range of farm exposures to FFA, 4-H, and all of that growing up, and it prepared me well for college and for this career.
Excellent, and you brought with some things today, and you want to tell us about BT corn.
Well, BT corn comes with a couple of different traits. One of those is a trait for protection against European corn borer, which has worked phenomenally well in Minnesota, and in fact has suppressed corn borer numbers to very low levels. The other one is a trait against to provide protection for corn roots from corn rootworm. And what you see in front of you are a couple of plants here. This is a more typical corn root with a full level of protection, very little rootworm damage. And you can see in this one how much pruning the corn rootworms have done. There's very little left in terms of roots to hold the plant up. And so what you see here with this bend is just a sign that this plant has fallen over during a thunderstorm and has struggled to get back upright.
And of course that's causing a lot of problems. We're not feeding the corn plant, we're not feeding the kernels, and then of course in the fall we have another problem, which is harvesting it.
Yeah, you can imagine when you've got these plants laying over on the ground that it's tough to get those plants pulled into the combine and get all of the yield that is there. And as you pointed out before, it's the loss of nutrient uptake, water uptake that has the primary impact. And the secondary impact is the fact that all of these corn leaves, which have been so carefully placed by the corn plants to catch the maximum amount of sunlight, once these plants fall over, of course, that's wasted, and so the plants again are struggling to collect sunlight, which is what farming is all about. So we see another yield hit there. A third yield hit can come from the fact that disease organisms can enter into these damaged areas on the roots, and then you can get root rots also entering the plants. So it's kind of a triple whammy plus the harvesting issues.
And possibly the next year, volunteer corn coming from the corn that was lost on the ground, causing yield drag on the next crop.
Yes, the volunteer corn is becoming a big issue. It provides continuity for the corn rootworms and ruins the rotational dimension the soybean's providing, as well as having the weediness factor of this volunteer corn out there.
We look at a healthy plant versus an insect damaged plant. What kind of economic impact in terms of dollars would we see per acre to the farmer?
Well, yield loss varies a lot with moisture stress. And so the key thing is not just this disruption of display, but then, you know, how much moisture stress the plant's under as it's trying to produce the kernels. So as a result, we see a lot of variation. But anytime you start to get more than one node gone, then we start to see losses build up. And in extreme cases, we may see up to a 50% yield loss. In a more typical scenario, we're probably running 10, 15 to 20 bushel yield losses.
Ken, what kind of economic impact can that mean to an acre of corn?
Well, it varies quite a bit depending on how much stress the plants are under. If they're under a great deal of moisture stress, the losses can really add up. The worst case I've ever seen is about a 50% loss. More typically, we see something in the range of like 10%, which might be 20 bushels, 15 bushels. But at today's corn prices, that's a tremendous hit.
And in most cases, 10% would probably wipe out a good share, if not all, the profits.
Exactly. And of course, the scenario that every grower hates to experience is when they have the severely lodged plants, you know, like this one, which is very difficult to pick up and adds time to combining. It might take 2 or 3 times as long to combine an acre of corn. And we know the 2 bottlenecks in farming are spring planting and harvesting. And so if we're not blessed with good harvesting conditions, you know, growers remember this for the rest of their life and want to avoid it at all costs.
Will it impact quality and maturity as well?
Yeah, typically when corn is lodged severely, you're going to see a delay in maturity. The corn is going to be wetter when it does come out of the field, and you can see a lot of variability from plant to plant depending on whether they stood or fell, and it just adds to the whole drying cost. One more insult to injury, so to speak.
Ken, you've identified it as a huge problem to the farmer, and then of course everybody that uses corn has to pay more for that product. Our swine producers, dairy producers. What do we do about it?
Well, typically what had been done in the past is to use a soil insecticide, and the corn that was basically at risk 20 years ago was corn following corn. Northern corn rootworms, one of the 2 species we have in Minnesota, pulled a big upset back in the late 70s and into the 80s when it developed resistance to crop rotation. So what had been working so well for us was just simple corn-soybean rotation that eliminated rootworm issues, but this rotational resistance now allowed northerns to basically use every acre of corn in Minnesota as a potential host. So when transgenic corn came on the marketplace, there were a lot of Minnesota growers that breathed a sigh of relief, because now it allowed them potentially to get away from soil insecticides, reduce their insecticide use, and simplify their planting operations. They just had to plant a kernel of corn and it had all the resistance built in.
And what's happened at this point that's causing stress?
Well, now one of the challenges we're facing is we see some signs that the traits aren't functioning as well as they did in the past. In other words, the rootworms are adapting. And it's the same thing we see whether we're talking about resistance to herbicides by weeds, resistance to insecticides, and now we have our crop rotation like with rootworms. And then now we have resistance potentially developing to these Bt traits.
Ken, are farm producers looking at management techniques like refuge management for this issue?
Well, one of the things the companies have been focusing on is changing the refuge options, and the one that's becoming widely available now is a seed mix, and that's where the refuge seed is in with the transgenic seed and appears randomly throughout the field, as opposed to a grower actually having to switch out all their seed to plant a block or have certain rows dedicated to refuge corn. So there are more options becoming available that make it easier for planting.
What's happening in technology and new products that might come out to help us with this problem?
Well, we're going to see some new traits coming down the road. Right now there are 3 traits on the marketplace. The problems that we're seeing, and incidentally this corn plant shows the damage from to a transgenic rootworm trait from these resistant larvae. But there are only one of the traits is having problems at this point, and it's against only western corn rootworm beetles. And it's mainly corn on corn fields where the guys have been using the same trait over and over and over. It's kind of just a natural selection process so that what we're left with is resistant beetles. But having said that, what companies are doing now is stacking 2 traits together. So for example, you might see Herculex and Agrasure traits together, or you might see Herculex and Yield Guard traits. So they're stacking traits in the hopes of building up a higher level of kill and making the resistance less likely to occur.
You spoke earlier about percentages of kill and the impact that means on the population of insects. Can you elaborate on that some?
Well, I think most growers are familiar with the BT traits for corn borer. Those are highly effective, kill about 99.9% of the caterpillars, and we haven't really seen any issues with corn borer resistance yet. The corn rootworm traits are a little different. They're not as effective in their kill. Typically see about 95% kill, 96% kill with the single traits. And that may not sound like a huge difference, but when you're dealing with 250,000 to 500,000 beetle larvae per acre, that really counts up and makes a lot of difference in how many beetles the growers see. So our hope is that these pyramids will bump that level of kill up high enough that it will reduce the chance of resistance developing, or at least delay the development of resistance.
So we used to rely on rotation.
Yes.
We've gotten away from that for economic reasons. Then we relied on BT and genetics. Now we should probably be scouting, or what should we be doing to look at this problem?
Well, I think the challenge for growers is we viewed this as kind of a silver bullet type thing, that just putting the seed out there was going to be enough and we could walk away from the field. For the growers that are experiencing the damage like this, they're really taking a second look at their whole management strategy, and I think that's a wise thing for all of us to do, is to take a look at what's happening in these fields. Don't just walk away from them. What kind of root injury are we seeing? What kind of beetle numbers? If you need some help with that, there are a lot of ag professionals in the state that know how to do the scouting for corn rootworms. And I think it's a good point to pause, look at what we've got in front of us, and decide whether or not we need to make some changes before we have some problems.
Great advice, and most any time of the growing season is a good time to scout, but is there a time that you would suggest to head off problems?
For corn rootworm beetles, probably the key time is the couple of weeks after pollination occurs. So once those silks come out, that's what the corn rootworms are keyed into, and then it's the population after that that's doing the egg laying.
Ken, what are the species of rootworm in Minnesota?
Well, in Minnesota we have 2 different corn rootworm species, a western corn rootworm and a northern corn rootworm, and the 2 differ a little bit in their behavior. The western corn rootworm is thought to be more tropical in origin, coming out of the Mexican highlands, sort of evolving with corn. The northern corn rootworm is thought to have adapted to corn from prairie grasses. And so you've got two different strategies, two different insects. They're similar in how they attack corn, but we see little differences, like the northerns are more winter hardy, and the westerns seem to do a little bit better on corn when they're together.
Well, you've certainly described a huge economic problem started by a very, very small insect. And it looks like it's a galloping problem, finding solutions, but thank you for the good work you do on that at the University of Minnesota.
It's a challenge. I can remember when transgenic corn first came out, and people who knew me and my work with corn borers would come up and offer their condolences and ask me what I was going to do next. And there's not been a shortage of things to work on.
When in doubt, bet on the insect, right?
That's correct.
Thanks for joining us, Ken.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
Another stop I made at the University of Minnesota was the Department of Food, Science, and Nutrition, where I learned a bit more about research on food itself. Dr. Tonya Schoenfuss has a background in food product development in the private sector and is now bringing that perspective to the research laboratory. Let's listen in as we discuss her efforts to create healthier dairy products.
Tonya, this is great. You brought us into the lab. What happens here?
Well, in this particular lab, it's sort of like a test kitchen. So this is where we can work on developing new food products. Our students participate in contests, so they learn how to develop products, like for healthier foods or foods for kids. And they get to actually put to use some of the things they learn in class and actually cook.
So you actually teach classroom and lab here?
Yes, in these buildings. In this lab, we do some work for product development class and things like that, where the students actually have to make something. Because most of our program is a lot of science and math, and it's really about the engineering and processing of food. Eventually, somebody has to eat that, so it's really useful to have them actually learn how to make food and do different recipes and try to manufacture something in a small scale. It's like gold standard type product.
You've got in front of us some products that, that maybe you put together or your students?
Well, so technically all the work is done by the students, but I came up with the ideas to try to get grant funding to help fund these projects. And so a lot of my projects are funded by dairy farmer checkoff dollars. And so I try to come up with ideas of things that will help make dairy products healthier, taste better, or sell for more money. So if we can come up with value-added uses for things like lactose, non-fat dry milk, and get it used maybe in replacing other products that might be getting used. So what I have here is a big push lately has been sodium reduction. So I've done a couple projects on reducing sodium in cheddar cheese, and I have a new project that just started looking at sodium reduction in blue cheese, because nobody's done that at all in the US, and it's very different because you rub the salt on the outside of the cheese and it has to slowly migrate to the inside. So if you really reduce it, what's going to happen? You have mold spores that grow on blue cheese, and if the salt helps slow them down. So if you put less in, how bad is the cheese going to get?
We don't want bad cheese.
No, there's an optimum level for salt in cheese, in natural cheeses, and it's actually there to control the organisms. So we're worried about flavor, we're worried about the texture, and then even more importantly is the safety. So what happens, is cheese going to be, if somebody mishandles it, like when I'm cutting these cubes, is it going to be less safe if it has less sodium? So that was a study we just have finished up. One of the students who graduated on Tuesday did that project.
Can we try it?
We can. So what we have is, this is full sodium cheese. So it's got about 600 milligrams per 100 grams of cheese. And so this is, it's got a good texture. I'm not going to vouch for the flavor. I'm a little disappointed. It's a little bitter.
Not bad.
But it's got a nice cheddar flavor. This is going, instead of just doing a slight reduction, it's not so hard to do maybe 25% reduction and still have really good cheese. But if you want to go to where you can label it low sodium, it's about a 60% reduction. So it's really hard. So this is reduced 60% without adding anything back to try to make it more like that. So in cheese, it's basically a big biochemistry experiment. So you have bacteria in there that are growing, they're eating the sugar, the lactose, they're breaking down the protein and the fat to change the texture when you age. And so if you don't control them with the salt, then they can make things happen you don't want to have happen.
Well, I did notice one difference already.
Yeah, it's very
As soon
crumbly.
as I tried to break off a piece of the lower sodium, this happened. So is that a result of the low salt?
Well, I was really surprised by that because I was expecting it to be very soft because the bacteria would break down the protein even more. But salt also contributes to the texture because it affects the protein. So like when you make bread, you always add salt. And bread is actually a big source of sodium in the diet. And it's not all because of the flavor. I know people a lot of times think we're just adding salt because it's just about flavor. But with bread, it changes the protein strength. You can do that experiment at home. Try to make some bread with no salt and make some with salt, and it'll change when you knead it, your ability to develop and strengthen that dough to hold the gas.
Interesting. Well,
So I think it affected the texture.
It must have. It also tastes more bitter.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
on this side,
Okay, on this side, we added potassium chloride back to try to replace the sodium, to try to control the microorganisms. So a problem with potassium chloride is that it in itself is bitter. So I'm not going to guarantee this isn't bitter at all. And it might be a different bitter. It actually kind of, I think, is also a little more salty. It's going to have a little more flavor.
it has a different texture.
Yeah. And these two were from the same curd. We separated at the end of cheese making and then just salted them differently. And these are the same age. This is a week older, actually. But they should be the same texture, and they're not, obviously. And this has kind of more fuller flavor, I think. A little more cheddar.
It does.
Do you get it the bitter too, or?
Not as much as this.
Well, that's awesome. Because everybody complains that KCL makes cheese bitter. It's like, well, if you make bad cheese by not putting in enough salt, it also is bitter. And that was my hypothesis from some of the previous studies. I'm like, you really need to add something back.
The students must feel very rewarded by coming and seeing a product done. Do you have tasting parties, or how does this?
Yeah, well, not for this particular study. Not this one, but another one we did with cheddar. We had consumer panels, and so that, it was kind of exciting because this actually scored equally to this. This still scored a little higher, but this one was not significantly different. So it says that people can't tell the difference really, and you don't always eat blocks of little cubes like this, right? So if you're melting it on something, really very slim chance they're going to notice a difference. So he was really proud of that result.
We have an obesity problem in our country, maybe double some countries.
Yeah.
34 to 36%. Are you doing any research or product development in that area?
We've been trying really hard to make lower fat products, especially cheese, and especially cheese that's going to be used maybe in the school lunch program, used on pizzas. It's not so hard to reduce cheese maybe up to 25%, and so in a third. When I was in graduate school for my PhD, I worked on low-fat cheddar cheese. And at that time, it was really hard to even make a third reduced. Nowadays, there's actually, from the research dollars, people have figured out some ways. You change your make procedures, you change some of your target pHs, just how you're making the cheese. So we can get like maybe a third reduction that's invisible. But to a full 50% or higher, to be considered low fat, it's actually more like 75% to 80% reduction. We're not there yet. So my first project here at the U of M was to try to go back and work some more. I had some other ideas. It didn't. I still don't have a good cheese.
Well, we need to keep trying,
Yeah,
of course.
I think so.
Tonya, this is wonderful. You've got a passion for it. You've helped a lot of people. Thanks so much for letting us take your time, but also coming into your kitchens, your labs. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Now it's time to meet this week's FFA Student Leader of the Week.
Hi, I'm Erin Larson from New Richland, Heartland, Ellendale, Geneva FFA Chapter, and I'm serving as this year's chapter president and also serving as Region 7 FFA Secretary. We currently raise about 40 meat goats, boar goats, and we show them and sell them to 4-Hers and FFA members, but I also have done livestock events for CDE with dairy cattle judging. My future plans with agriculture is to attend an agriculture-based school, either the University of Minnesota or University of Wisconsin, River Falls, where both my sisters have attended, and also major in ag business marketing with communications and be able to talk about agriculture with people and also continue my passion with livestock. But it's up to us to make a difference so then the people get the correct story on how we treat our animals with respect and how we are able to put a wholesome product on their table. I am committed to the FFA organization because it's shown me a way of life and how I can be an agriculture advocate for it. I am also committed because my family members have been in FFA, and also it's what I have passion for with dealing with the livestock that I raise and show through FFA.
Thanks for joining me. I hope you were able to learn new things as we went back to school today. See you next time on Farm Connections.
Farm Connections on KSMQ, sponsored in part by the Cedars of Austin, a senior living community. We even have a retired farmers club. Independent, assisted, and memory care apartments. Learn more at cedarsofaustin.com. Will Mahler, the ag attorney, has been representing dairy farms in Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin for 37 years. Will Mahler, the ag attorney's office is in Rochester, and Will is a proud partner of Farm Connections. Thanks, Will Mahler.